urban inequality and failed governance to a large extent, where wealth dictates access, how does an architecture practice situate itself to effect its desired role as a practitioner rooted firmly within the sphere of the public? How does a practice respond to an increasingly polarizing urban environment, especially when it chooses to place itself within that context, to not to shy away from it, but rather delve into it and dive into its depths to explore what negotiations are possible or direly needed, keeping in mind the complexities of the city's actors, the politics, the place, the people, and the profit. In an environment where less and less is in the hands of the public and more is in the control of the private, whether a corporation or an individual, what place does social equity and civitas have? And hence, as a response to many of these kind of questions that comes with every project that we do, because of this particular context within which we practice today, our approach has been in twofold. One, that of a larger territory of the urban, its geography, economics, and the ecology, and the other that of a more localized urban intervention, the urban building or an urban insert, as the case may be. And each of these scales have led in a manner of engagement that is quite distinct for each one, a duality of an operation within that practice. And this is not to say that, our end goal in any of these projects that we do is to kind of try and achieve the create spaces that celebrates life, that allows people to come together, but the manner in which one approaches both these kind of projects is completely different, or the process is completely different. The first one deals with the direct engagement with the civitas to effect, facilitate, or to actualize transformations within the realm of the cityscapes, along with a set of committed and equal collaborators, as such becoming a part of an ecology of catalyzers that work towards interventions within systems, communities, and environments. Here, our efforts are towards inventing and reaffirming the possibilities of public space, public dignity, public access, and positive urban open space interventions within settings where one wouldn't deem these are possible. The second one deals with re-envisioning what an architecture practice can affect and actualize through its commissions, so that the built artifacts transcend being mere just object buildings. These objects, instead of becoming facilitators of a future urbanism, by choosing to engage creatively with local planning regulations, deploying spatial strategies that foster a sense of community, a sense of public, and a sense of civitas, even where these are not necessarily part of a client brief. So I'll just continue to kind of talk about the context within which we practice. And these are some of the images that pops up every time we talk about the idea of a smart city, the idea of sort of the digital urbanism. And these are, I just pulled it out from the website. I think this is from the Gift City, one of the proposals in the early stages of Gift City. The other one is from the Amravati proposal. And you can go through these images and understand what is the context within which we practice today. So images related to smart cities tend to produce a futuristic urbanism, often at the cost of basic needs and fundamental human rights, consists of skyscrapers, multiple flyovers, glitzy streets, and bright lights. And these are often modeled on cities located in disparate regions of the world. And none of these images seem to portray mixed income neighborhoods, social housing, street vendors, women's and children's security, and integrated development paradigms. And these are all in many sense imported images that we kind of project as what the future of our cities should be. So one wonders, who are these cities being created for? If the predominant visual of the smart city, this is not necessarily tied to just the smart city, but any of our kind of discussion on the future of the cities at a larger policy level has the same kind of a thinking. Is predominant visual of the smart city is one in which there is no space for the poor, and can this be a sustainable and equitable model for the future? So these are some of the kind of the context within which we practice today. I titled the early set of, or the first set of projects as working in between the lines. And these are the projects which we work as planners, urban designers, and architects, but we extensively collaborate with other partners who are ecologists, who are economists, who are in other fields, allied fields, to be able to come together and kind of work on a collaborative process. And hence, our role is largely is not determined who we are as a designer, but more as a collaborator and more as a facilitator to be able to kind of drive the various stakeholders together to kind of create public realm, and I call it the collective space and a collaborative process. These are this is the first one I want to talk about is a quick project that we worked right after the Chennai floods few years back. With the project was initiated by a group out of Mexico called Program Waka, who reached out to us to kind of collaborate on this, along with funded by Care Foundation, and we started to look at a very smaller community just outside the city of Chennai, who got very badly affected by the Chennai floods. And this is a community which largely engaged in begging as their means of income. And it was a community of about 10 families which had a small piece of land just outside the city, and the floods had really thrown them out. And then Care Foundation kind of graciously offered some money to kind of build these houses back, but it was extremely tight, and they had a budget of about $600 to build, which is roughly about 40,000 rupees to build each of these houses. And we started collaborating with this group out of Mexico and Spain called Program Waka. They primarily kind of engage and work with these kind of communities, travel across the world and engage in many communities like this. And we collaborated with them to kind of try and work with this particular community to be able to create a new little village for them. And when we started, it's interesting, and it kind of, in many sense, opened up many thought processes. And one of the critical aspect is that, what you call as sustainability. When we started this project, the first day I remember a politician came and and told us that you can't build houses here because there's a temple there, and everybody started panic. The community was very insecure, and they got into some sort of a conflict, etc., etc. And we realized that the first thing we needed to do is to kind of bring them together. So we said, let's start to work with them. I mean, the entire team kind of moved there for about a couple of weeks, and tried to kind of started working with the community itself. And the primary objective was that if what we built has to be sustainable, it has to be then thought through by them and built by them. And we were also at that point looking at a ways to engage with them in a way that they can actually take this as a profession, which allows them to maybe tomorrow come out of the sort of the begging as their means of income, and start to kind of get into more of this building process as such. So we've pulled the communities together. We started engaging with them. The first thing we realized that at that point that we need to build a community center, and so that's, I mean, this was not part of our original thinking, but given the sort of the circumstances that led into it, we realized that it's important to kind of create a little community center right at the beginning, so that it allows them to kind of come together. So we were also questioning what is the long-term sustainability of what we build. It was clear to at some point that sustainability is not necessarily coming from the tectonics, but the process through which we build these things. And that's kind of what we did. So we engaged with them. Most of the sketches are also driven by a lot of the comments that came from them. We tried to source many of the materials from locally, because it was a very tight budget to work with. And each of the houses, there were around 8 houses. Each house were built by the people who were going to live there. And that's kind of how we started engaging with them, and it went through a different process. Of course, there were many challenges as we went through it, but the idea of building it in a participatory manner, we realized that that's kind of what, in many sense, brings long-term sustainability to this community. And it's interesting that towards the end of the process, these politicians again came back And at that point, the entire community was united and was able to kind of strongly oppose what they were trying to put in as a trying to stop the work, and that allowed the community to feel much stronger, and there is a sense of place and sense of community through the process through which one built that came through. And it's interesting. It was just one space because and the entire thing was lifted up. There was a large higher plinth. The ground, the lower level was completely left open because of the ankle. The section we were able to get a one sleeping space upstairs, which is what you kind of see here, and that kind of took care of the needs of what they needed to live in that, and um, that's kind of how we were able to kind of source everything locally and able to build this within $600 of expense. This is another project that we again started working with this trust called Care Earth. They were starting to looking at cleaning up a few of the lakes in Chennai, and we realized that every time you do a cleaning process, someone comes and cleans this, and a few months back everything is back to where it was. And one of the thoughts that drove this is also to kind of start to again use these projects as a way to engage with the community, educate them, for us as architects to kind of try and understand that context, and also allow them to kind of take ownership of the place around this more as a public space, so that it has a certain kind of a long-term sustainability and somebody takes ownership of it. You can see the, I mean, the data here, the wetlands, and in 1980 there was about 186 square meters of wetlands in the entire Chennai, and by the time you reach 2010, it became 71 square kilometer of wetlands. And this is, I'm sure this is true with any cities that we do here. We are constantly kind of sort of taking away all these critical ecological aspects of our city, and this is a small area, again in the periphery of the city, although now it is no more a periphery. It's just the southern part of the city. It's an area called Perinkulattur. And we started working with Care Earth Trust, who largely looked at the ecological aspects of the project. Then they primarily looked at maintaining the wetland area, the improve the water retention, minimize the groundwater depletion, restoring wetlands, species diversity, etc., etc. And our role was to primarily kind of try and establish and protect the lake boundary. And this lake has been encroached upon over the years more and more. And our idea or critical thinking was to how do we kind of activate that lake edge so that people who live there take ownership of it, and not they don't become back doors to the community. Rather, it becomes your front door, or kind of the front of the community, and look to activate edges of the lake through interventions of small little play areas, etc., etc., and hence inculcate a sense of community and ownership. Also the treatment of wastewater prior to release to the lake. That's the just a little historical perspective of how these you can see all the lakes around it, and they are all interconnected to a large extent. And what happens is the runoff from the Wandalur Hills. Also on the eastern side is the hills, and all the runoff from the Wandalur Hills flow into these agricultural lands in Perinkulattur, while recharging the Periyeri, Siteri, and eventually flowing into the Adayar River. And that's the kind of the general flow of the things that happen there. And you can see the the evolution of the area itself. I mean, it used to be farmlands with that's the there is the lake that we intervened, and you can see the amount of farmlands around it in early 1900s. Then a certain kind of industrial activity started happening. The highway was built on the lake, and industrial activities, the standard motors moved in there, and that kind of started urbanization started at that point, and all these areas started getting encroached upon, and it kept growing over a period of time. You can see the 1998 the water bodies, the wetlands, and it came down, and you can see the drop in 2002. That farmland got reduced substantially, and then there was another flood, and the wetland area increased, and it keeps changing. It's very interesting. In 2011 again it came down, in 2014. And then by 2017, again, another set of floods happened and the wetlands area increased. And so, the environment, the climate constantly punishes us, but we never seem to learn from it. So for us, it was an opportunity to really kind of study the context, and use this as a way to kind of understand a bit of that neighborhood as well. So what you see in dotted lines here is the original lake boundary, and you can see the amount of encroachments that happened over the years, and the lake has become almost one third of what it was, and quite bad shape as well. So the idea was not to kind of all these mapping processes, not to really try and remove the people who encroached upon it, but try and kind of figure out a way to kind of stop this encroachment further, and try and give a certain sense of ownership to the people who live around it. And so there's a lot of mapping and analysis done in terms of street characters, street activities, and you can see the lake conditions all along the edges. And that's the Wanderloo Hills, where the water flows down into these lakes. And you can see the sort of the fabric around it, um, land uses. So the idea was then to start to kind of look at these key points where one can start to intervene, and looking at pockets within the edge of those sites, to kind of activate them, and look at these pockets which are right now negative spaces, try and look at them or activate them. And the key aspect to all these we've realized is to kind of at that point start to engage with the community. So Jayashree from Care Earth initiated this entire community process to be able to educate the people about what is the importance of the lake and why we need to preserve it, etc., etc. So this was a huge process, because we felt that design is not that important at that point. I mean, of course, as designers, we try and do things, but it's not it's not what we are intervening, but the nature or the process through which how we are intervening is more critical. And hence we felt that educating them through the process was one of the key aspects of to make sure that this gets cleaned up, and there is a certain kind of maintenance and sustainability to what we do. One of the key aspects was to kind of go into the government schools around the area, to try and kind of work with the students and educate them at a young age, to be able to kind of make them understand what is the importance of the lakes and why we need to preserve, etc., etc. Of course, engaging with the politicians is part of the deal to get any of these things done. And looking at, these are some of the pictures of before and after, how the entire restoration process started to happen. There were a lot of invasive plants within the lake, which had to be removed upfront to be able to engage with that, stabilizing the peripheral or the edge of the lake. And you can see, once it's cleaned up, the kind of the complete nature of the lake has changed. And there are a lot of migratory birds that comes into these lakes, and it becomes a wonderful place for all of them to kind of engage with. Public spaces mirror our culture and time. They cast reflections that tell us about the well-being of our inhabitants. One can, in many ways, determine how inclusive a city is by just looking at the width of the sidewalk. A great city can be measured by the nature of the public spaces that we build. Today, cities are primarily a places for commerce. Traditionally, they have also served as settings for broad range of cultural activities and as arenas for the meeting of ideas. For the city to sustain its important role as a center of commerce, the arts and the intellectual discourse, a new sensitivity towards and the amount and quality of the public space, the space between the buildings is needed. So this is again another project that we initiated quite a few years back. This is an intersection very close to our office is located, and we wanted to, and it was around also the time we started engaging in many of the housing projects, and we realized that many our cities don't have the kind of spaces that one needs to live in a city, and we, even within our housing developments, what we provide is not enough, and hence we need to really look at creating larger public spaces that try and kind of allow people to come together. Our cities are increasingly becoming just a collection of objects with no relationship to each other, and a life driven within the cars, and not necessarily within the public realm. So if you, and this is a neighborhood called Adayar, which is really, and that's the Adayar River. So this intersection, or the kind of the area that we looked at, it is right after that bridge. So it's in many ways is a gateway to south of Chennai, and this is the southern part of Chennai. South of Chennai, and we felt that it is a critical junction that one can intervene in. And if you look at Chennai as a city, it has about 426 square kilometers of land area. It has roughly about 11 million people. It has a density of about 139 people per acre. And if you look at the open space that we have, it is about 0.81 square meter per person. And what WHO, if you look at the sort of the minimum requirement in many sense, per person in order to live in a city is about 9 square meters, and what we have is 0.81. And now if you look at this, I'm sure many of our cities will be in the same kind of bracket, and we in many sense really in dire need of public spaces. So this is that intersection. It's called Arvind Plaza because there is an Arvind booth there, and it became quite famous. And it's over the period of time, it's known as Arvind Plaza. It's really at the sort of the foot of the Adaya Bridge where you cross across. And what is interesting is that it has all these different neighborhoods on different parts. One side is Besant Nagar, there is Gandhi Nagar, there is Kasturbai Nagar, Indira Nagar, and again Besant Nagar on the other side as well. And what is interesting is that it has and they are all in some sense different income groups, different this thing. So over a period of time, what happened, like many of our intersections, there was traffic challenges. We built flyovers because that's the easiest way to apparently to solve the traffic problem. So the flyover came in and we killed that space below it. And I'm sure this is true with many of our intersections in every cities. So what happened is what is traditionally meant to kind of tie people together as a space is now divides people together, and that's what and more these neighborhoods became completely detached from each other in many ways because of the sort of that flyover and the other kind of infrastructure which comes in more as a divider. And you can see here the nature of that particular intersection. Wide roads, lot of asphalt, people moving everywhere, though no clarity on where people need to walk, inadequate sidewalks, they walk on the road, cars are parked closer to the sidewalks. I mean, the true nature of many of our intersections in any cities, and these are not unique to Chennai, and traffic violations, intersections within intersections, haphazard parkings. So what we started is to kind of try and use this as a way to again understand the sort of the larger neighborhood, and we started analyzing the city as a structure, and started to kind of mapping many of these things, what the figure grounds are, what is, and it has a remarkable amount of vegetation. There is a theosophical society right next to this intersections, which is filled with trees and an open green space. And you can see the amount of greeneries even along the Adaya lake edge. And so there are many opportunities, and these are some of the views of the Adaya from the Adaya bridge. So you can see the I mean, you can see the opportunities that a context like this presents, but the ground realities are completely different. Again, more and more mapping. We also looked at analyzing both as a structure and also as an experience. A lot of schools in that neighborhood, so you can see when the school gets over, the students just come into that intersection, and a lot of encroachments. Students sit on the sidewalks, hardly any sidewalks. And these are some of the sketches which kind of illustrates the character of that place. And so one of the key aspects we said is that we really want to use this place as a way to kind of tie all these neighborhoods together, and that's kind of what we started with. And we really felt that this is the gateway to the south of Chennai, and hence it needs to kind of reflect what Adyar is all about, which has traditionally been one of the most green neighborhoods of the city itself, and try and really kind of bring in some of those characters back. And that's kind of how we started, and also then start to tie these critical nodes. On one end of this is the Arvind Plaza, but on the other end, within a walking radius, is the one of the local train stations. On the other end is the bus depot. So we wanted to kind of um, um, intervene in that both these streets in a way that it can be pedestrianized, or tied through pedestrian networks, which brings all of this neighborhood under a walking radius. Also, again, there are a lot of green activities on the other edge, uh, engage with the Theosophical Society in a way that that greenery can be maximized and kind of pulled into that. On the other end is the beach. So again, looking at bicycle tracks and other recreational activities coming in to kind of tie to the beach and beach with that intersection. And that kind of, in some sense, became the framework within which we feel that we can then tie the entire neighborhood in some ways together in a very sort of pedestrian friendly manner. And that's like I said, this is a project that we originally initiated ourselves. Then we started to engage with the corporation got very excited. They've for years we've been kind of negotiating and kind of looking at it. One of our key arguments that look at this entire intersection as a park right now, and mind it, it's one of the most heavy traffic thoroughfares on this along the as you come from the northern side of the city to the southern end of the city. And so what we said is that let's reimagine this entire space as a park, and then start to carve out these thoroughfares, etc., from that. And what it means is that right now there is a lot of these leftover spaces. So we were able to kind of create large parks and large sidewalks even without losing a single lane, but just by organizing them. And that's kind of what you see here as a diagram. And if you go into the ground right now, what you see is that all these are asphalt, right? And the traffic, we still have a 3-lane traffic. All the traffic lanes are maintained, but you are able to kind of recapture many of the spaces that are lost to the cars and the asphalt, and to make them and green them and make them public spaces. This is the typical section through that junction. It's largely vehicular driven. We want to kind of reverse it and kind of make it more pedestrian friendly, and look at street as an extension of the building edge, the right to walk, the street culture, congregation, leisure. So completely reimagine that plaza. And there is a bridge there which is extremely wide, and it's often a bottleneck because once you come out of the bridge, you again kind of hit by the tight narrow street. And so what we were saying is to kind of really, again, only allow what is needed for the traffic movement, and recapture the rest of the what is given for cars for public realm, and look at it more as a pedestrian space. And that's what some of the initial visuals that we put together, looking at all of this, try and really calm down the traffic and recapture that as a public space. And then we, of course, one of the main hindrances was the traffic police. They were always objecting to any of these changes because they feel that the traffic will be greatly impacted by any interventions. And one thing we did is that for a couple of days, we actually did almost like a tactical urbanism. We marked all these on the site with the traffic police to primarily engage with those stakeholders. And this is why I talked about the process through which we engage. And these are all about engaging with the stakeholders, make them comfortable, make them part of the process. So the traffic police is one of them, engaging with the corporation, having discussions with the hawkers, residents, shop owners. All these kind of engagement is extremely critical, because only then long-term sustainability comes. Because even though you intervene in this and you may come out as a designer, tomorrow somebody has to take ownership of it and try and make sure that this is maintained. And that is where all these engagement with all these stakeholders becomes critical. And you can see here, most of these areas is already filled with dust and this thing, and clearly that that is not where the vehicle is going, even though there is an asphalt there. So you can really easily recapture all these spaces, and we literally started marking them on the site to be able to kind of see the amount of space that we can really start to take over as public realm. And what it does is that then we realize that there are plenty of nodes like this in the city, and you can see these are all the intersections which has a similar conditions. And so what we've argued with the corporation is that once you create this, you can then repeat this in every intersection that exists there within the city of Chennai. And today we are actually about few months back, we've been contracted to look at the entire neighborhood So we are actually looking at the entire Adyar as a whole, as a neighborhood, not just this plaza, to try and kind of really pedestrianize the entire neighborhood and look at other potential public spaces to come in and encourage non-motorized transport. So the economic context that we live in today throws many challenges which deeply impact the long-term sustainability of our cities. Our building bylaws and regulations often work in a reactionary manner. The permanence that the buildings offer through good architecture historically, which is what Aldo Rossi through the image of the city, are being challenged in this context. Hence, if our cities need to survive and continue to be livable, we need the open spaces, spaces in between to offer the permanence around which the cities can constantly transform. So these are a set of projects, which is the second kind of set of projects that I talked about, which is what takes up 70 to 80% of our time within the studio, and these are primarily your traditional approach to architecture, which is the mere urban insertions, and very similar kind of thinking or the learning of the context kind of start to influence what we do there as well. And these are some of the things which I already talked about when I presented at Feed, but I'll go through some of these key important aspects as well. And this is, in some sense, the second aspects of the practice. So there are certain statistics. I mean, I often use this as a way to kind of talk about the context within which we practice today. And by about 2050, we are about 70 to 75% of world's population is expected to live in urban areas. And what you see more critically is the second statistics, which says that India's global land share is about 2%, while India's global population share is about 17%. And we believe that in many ways there is a very unfair share of land that we have, and hence the pressure on the land will always be there in any of the cities that we intervene, or in any of the contexts that we intervene in India. And hence we believe that we can't talk about sustainability without dealing with density. And this is one of the key aspects of the thinking process within the studio, is that how do we kind of negotiate density to be able to kind of take care of the needs of 17% of world's population. And we also believe that in many ways, if we are able to take care of the needs of 17% of world's population in 2% of land, it's actually a wonderful sustainable way of living. And hence we believe we need to kind of engage with this challenging context, and not to kind of step back from it, but to engage with these issues that are staring at us every day. Again, some of the things that I talked earlier, which is these two figure grounds, which becomes extremely critical for the thinking process to many of our projects. The one that you see on the right is your traditional Nully plan, which is your traditional city, and one you see on your left is your figure ground, which is what we build today, any of our cities, if you look at it. And for us, in many ways, what you see on the right, which is your traditional Nully plan, is not just a figure ground diagram, it's actually a sustainability diagram. For me, that is a city of memories, that is a city of culture, that is a city where there is a close relationship between buildings and the ground, and there is a constant dialogue. And what you see on the left are just subdivisions, and this is what our cities are today. Our cities are is not about the collective realm, but it is a collection of plots subdivided, and we all intervene in a plot, leave our setbacks and build our object and come out, and it has nothing to do with the idea of the collective realm. And so this is, and if you, our bylaws are also written in many ways like that. And these are a couple of images of Scully Square before urban renewal and after urban renewal. And you can see the one on the left, there is so much life, while on the right you have a beautiful modernist building with a lot of open space, but you can see there is less of activities. And Rove, through his collage city, often talked about this. He talked about, in fact, he called for architects to give away the fixation with the space and the object, and try and look for a constant dialogue between the space and the figure, so that one is able to kind of negotiate both, and in the process you build less of the figure and less of the ground. And his argument was also that in the coming decades the land will be so scarce, that it will be extremely challenging to kind of look at urbanism the way somebody like Corbusier looked at it, where the objects kind of sit on these large swaths of land or a park. They are beautiful, but they kind of tend to kind of not respect each other, or the idea of collective realm is completely lost. Kulhas talked about in similar lines in his generic city, and these are set of diagrams which in some ways illustrates that. And to me, in many sense, it is not about the public itself. I mean, it's not just the public. What works beautifully in a good city is also this relationship between the private, public, and semi-public, and the blurred boundaries between them, or the blurred boundaries that tie them together. So the it's private is as important as the public, but there has to be a certain kind of relationship between these private and semi-public and public spaces, and that in totality it becomes a wonderful place to live. And if you look at the traditional Noli plan, for example, what you see is a figure ground like this, where you have buildings built to the property edge. You have an internal courtyard. What it suddenly does is that it creates activities along the public realm, which is your sidewalks. It activates the sidewalks. You have programs which opens into it. You get a semi-public space which is inside, which is your traditional courtyard. And this section start to kind of illustrate that. So you have a street, the sidewalks get activated because there are activities on the ground floor of these buildings, because they come right to the edge of the building. The courtyards then becomes a sort of a semi-public or a community space. Then the private space suddenly start to have a relationship to that, and that in totality is what I call it as a collective realm. It's not just about the public realm, it's the blurred boundaries that kind of ties all of them, all these three things together. So what do we do here today? I mean, with our building bylaws and building regulations and the way we build today, what we do is that we take that same plot and leave setbacks. And the moment you leave setbacks, you are left with building an object. Because what happens is that that entire setback becomes taken over by cars. It's often a fire driveway. Even if you have a road here, you're required to leave a fire driveway all around your building. And what you're left with is, to accommodate all the density requirement, you have to build it like an object. And suddenly what happens is that our ground then becomes entirely parking. You can see many of our buildings we enter through parking. And so the most valuable thing, and the most thing which is kind of scarce in our land, we actually give it to the cars, and the cars then taken over. And what it also does is that you can see the sidewalks of the setbacks are taken over by cars because it's fire driveway, and the street itself will be taken over by cars, because there is no, now suddenly there's no activation of that particular street. And so the sidewalks, the roads, everything is taken over cars. So what happened is that eventually all of them in many ways becomes private. My private unit, my private car, and my private car which I drive in a public street, right? So what that beautifully happens in a sustainable city, which is that relationship, or those blurred relationship between private, semi-public, and public, suddenly gets broken up completely, and everything in many ways becomes private. And that's how we live today in our cities. I take my car, go to work, I take my car back and come back to my home. There is no space in between. There is no relationship between any of the, or there's no idea of a third space which start to kind of tie them together. And this is largely driven by the way our building bylaws are written. And so how do one kind of then practice within this context? And you can see here, and then it gets repeated one after another. So you can see the idiocy of it right here. I mean, there are two plots next to each other. Both of them will give a fire driveway. And in a good city, one fire driveway could satisfy both of them. And you can see the amount of space that one can start to recapture as public realm. But here we leave two fire driveways. We are just building asphalts afterwards, increasing the heat island effect within the city, and also creating a city which is a sort of a collection of objects. So how do we practice in a context like this? And this is the biggest challenge that we have as practitioners, or when we engage in architecture practices in any of our cities. And our cities becomes a collection of objects, like what you see here in Dubai, for example. There are a lot of interesting twisting buildings there, but you can remove any of those buildings and replace it with another twisting one. It never changes the nature of the city, and it continues to be a collection of objects. And you can see there are a lot of grounds, like the way you've seen in that other figure ground. there is actually less figure and more grounds, but those grounds are then taken over by cars and flyovers and highways, etc., etc. So it's important to understand what kind of cities that we want to build. And for us, it's also critical that going forward, if 70% of world's population is going to live in urban areas, it's how do we kind of look at sustainability and how do we fix this ruptured urban fabric and or engage with that. So our thinking in architecture parallels our thinking on cities, and these are a set of projects that we are doing. Most of it is complete inside a university here in Chennai, just outside south of the airport, in city in an area called Wandelur. It's a university called Crescent University, and we finished about 4 or 5 buildings there. 4 of them are institutional, 3 of them are built. The institutional ones are built to our housing, which is already built. When we started engaging with this campus, we realized that it is a wonderful opportunity to kind of explore some of these thoughts and kind of try and look at the campus as a microcosm of a larger city, as a public space, and how do we kind of negotiate this relationship between the figure and the ground. And so we started with the first building, this is actually a post-design diagram which we put together after we finished designing all these buildings. And I want to say that when we started the first building, we didn't know that we were going to do the next or the next and the next. So, but it was very clear that we want to do each building in a way that it start to activate that campus, right? And it was not about the object, but what that object did to that campus or activate that campus. It was also an opportunity for us to explore how one can start to create vertical campuses, because this is, by the time we were going to engage with the campus, it has largely transitioned from a sort of a peri-urban to a large urban campus, and most of the existing buildings were about 3 and 4 stories. And when we started to engage, there was a requirement for a larger density, and it was clear to us that they all become multi-story campuses. And hence, how do we kind of create? And it was a wonderful opportunity for us to explore the idea of creating vertical campuses without kind of losing that relationship to the ground. And it was a constant, hence it was a constant negotiation between those figure and the ground, and how do one kind of tackle that. And this is a post-design diagram that we put together after we stitched all of them together. And we didn't had a master plan. We didn't start with a master plan because we didn't know which are the buildings we were doing. But every time we did, we slowly started stitching one after another. So this is the campus. It's a 60-acre campus. That's the highway which goes to Trichy. The airport is north of the campus. What is beautiful about the campus is that it's all around surrounded by forest. One side is a zoo, the other side is a forest, and hence we were very clear that nothing will come next to our campus. So it offered these wonderful views as you went up. So we wanted to start to catch all of this. Although this was a 60-acre campus, most of the campus were taken over by another trust which owns a school, and hence we were left with roughly about 20 acres to kind of do all these buildings. And this is primarily the engineering campus. So that was the first site that we intervened, which is the School of Aeronautics. And you can see here, this is the main entrance to the campus. Quite formal, very well, planned in some sense. A lot of wonderful trees already exist in the campus. But what you can, and that's the street which is more of an informal street, which is perpendicular to that main entrance, which actually led into our first site. And you can see here, what the existing buildings did. While we analyzing, we realized there were a lot of these wonderful spaces that existed within the campus, but they all turned their back towards those streets, and hence, the buildings never kind of was in a dialogue with this campus, and they were all kind of reading as objects. And so for us, the biggest challenge was to kind of design these buildings in a way that it not only activates the space around it, but it activates the entire campuses as well. So that was the first site. At the end of that street was a beautiful banyan tree, which already existed there. And one side of that is where we intervene. So what we have done is we kind of, broken down the scale of the building, because the building was quite large. It's about 180,000 square feet. And we realized that if we start to kind of create that such a building mass, it start to kind of impact the way people interact with that space or the building, and hence it was critical to kind of break down that scale of the building. And these are many of the complexities that kind of comes with every project we do, and we believe that when we engage in projects like this, we can't ignore these other critical aspects, which, and it's not about the object, it's how that object start to kind of stitch itself to that context. So we broke the scale of the building, we broke them into different wings, we allowed one of them to kind of respond to that banyan tree, and that street acknowledge that, and in a way that that street then comes and opens up into a little space outside that building, and then one start to kind of weave that building into that, and that's a section of the building. You can see that negotiation between the figure and the ground, and in many ways we actually left all these buildings open, and these buildings then become an extension of the ground, right? It's an open campus in some sense. Of course, there were a lot of challenges negotiating this process itself, but you can see that that ground just flows into that building, and hence, even though these were all different departments, the ground then became a public space. What we also did is that the larger programs, this was a department of aeronautics, so it had these larger labs. There was a hangar where there's a small aircraft kept, all those kind of larger programs we tucked into that ground floor, so one is not able to experience the bulkiness or the scale of those larger programs, and you kind of negotiate that with this public space which just flow into the building, and it opens into a courtyard once you come in. So here you can see that relationship between what I talked about earlier, which is the public, private, and semi-public space. And you can, in some sense, literally see in that section that negotiation and that blurring of those boundaries, which is what makes, in some sense, bring in a certain kind of an identity or a certain kind of is this relationship at different scales. Uh, and as we went up, we started to look at creating multiple spaces at different levels. All of them start to kind of engage with the ground. And this is once it was complete, you can see that space outside. It just, the ground just flowed into that building. The ground is articulated in a way that they all become public spaces. One can sit, eat lunch, and these spaces then becomes very engaging in many sense. It's an like I said, it's a completely open building. You just flow into that this thing, the ground gets extended into that building. And you broke down the scale of that building, so you can see when I stand here, I relate to that two-story mass of the brick, and I'm not necessarily kind of relating to that larger scale. So you're constantly trying to break that scale, so that even though it was a massive building, one is extremely comfortable standing there, and there is a certain kind of porous, of course the wind flows through this, that allows the building to be much more lighter than what it is in many sense. It just becomes an extension of that campus. One of the side entrances, again articulating to kind of create more and more congregational spaces, and then it gets occupied in different ways. I mean, this is from the first floor looking down, and they all, although it goes up one floor, you can see that relationship. You're constantly in connect with the larger context and kind of relate to that, and then that podium kind of opens into that context and the forest. This is a space at the third floor, opens up, a four level kind of a space, again opens up and kind of relate to the building which is on the side. This is one of the spaces. So along the corridor, we kind of, excuse me, plugged in these little pause spaces outside each of the classrooms where one can come and sit for some time, and not just the corridors don't just become circulation spaces. And it pops into that courtyard open to sky. So you can see they start to constantly make that relationship to that ground, and it also becomes in some sense a language or a vocabulary for that inside part of that courtyard. And then it gets occupied in different ways, and for us this is in many sense what architecture is all about, and this is what we try to define through architecture. Here Palasma says that buildings are not abstract meaningless constructions or aesthetic compositions. They are extensions and shelters of our bodies, memories, identities, and minds. Consequently, architecture arises from existentially true confrontations, experiences, recollections, and aspirations. And for us, these spaces are then becomes extensions of the program spaces, and that is where memories are created. That is where identities are created, and which is extremely critical when you build campuses. This is another building which we started doing while we were doing the other building. There was a requirement for a lot more classrooms, etc. What is marked here is the existing three-story building. So when we started to look at this as a larger, taller building, we were asked to repeat what was already existing, and we said we need to relook at it because we can't obviously repeat what was built 30 years back. And we said, let's look at that. And because it was a smaller footprint, we realized that we can't kind of create the kind of spaces that we created in the other building because it will become extremely inefficient. And hence, what we did is that when we went up to the third floor roof, we realized that there is already a ground existing there at the third floor. All we needed to do is to articulate this building in a way that it start to engage with that particular space, which is otherwise lying as dead, and respond to that so that it can just activate that. So you don't actually need to build new spaces. You just need to use the buildings as a way to kind of activate that. And this is what Rove talked about when he talked about that dialogue between the figure and the ground. And in the process, one can build less figure and less ground because you are in perfect harmony with each other. So for us, it was an opportunity to explore that. How do one kind of start to engage with that space, activate with the program there at that particular level? So what we've done is, it was a simple recliner box which is kind of extruded, which started to kind of respond to that. There's a street here, so the bottom base started pull back, and what it does is that it kind of breaks down again the scale of that building, and there were a lot of trees next to that sidewalk. So when you walk on the sidewalk, the scale of the building is not never perceived, and you're constantly kind of relating to a three-story campus while the density rises up. And that's kind of the sort of the conceptual section which start to kind of talk about what I said. Because it was a smaller footprint, we kind of concentrated all the core into one side. That gives the flexibility for the rest of the floor plate to be changed, redesigned, etc. over a period of time, and allow these. We also took one staircases out, so that it also becomes, while it's a circulation space, it also becomes some sort of an amphitheater space overlooking into the larger context and the forest, etc., etc. And that's that space. So it's almost like, I mean, these steps are hardly used as circulation spaces, but more as interaction spaces. So it was an extremely tight building, had to work very efficiently. So we are using many ways with the elements that are there to kind of create more and more social spaces for people to kind of come together. And that idea then also becomes the expression of the building. That's a western facade. You can see the section of the building articulated very clearly, or the idea of the building articulated very clearly in that western facade, almost in a pure manner. And that's the third floor level which start to kind of relate to that. This is the School of Architecture, and that we recently completed, and a canteen space that we designed. Again, very tight side within the campus. You can see very narrow side, very linear side. Again, extremely challenging. Although it was a larger campus, these sites within that are very extremely challenging. So how do you design an architecture school with the kind of spaces that one needs in such a rectilinear manner, almost like a box? How do a kind of one start to engage with that and create the kind of spaces one need to create? It's almost like an urban insert where you kind of start to plug in, but it was also at the end of that the main entrance. So, and this is where the School of Life Sciences, that second building that I showed. So we realized we can create a space at the end of that corridor, which then kind of becomes an address to both these buildings, onto which then one start to tie the architecture school together. And that's kind of diagrammatically. So with every building, we were stitching the campus together. So sectionally, we realized there was a slight topography to the side. It kind of slopes down. So again, we allowed the campus to kind of come into that building, left it open. It opens out, goes into a public space on the other side. And this is the canteen or the student activity center that we are right now designing, which again becomes stitched to that. So the campus just flows through that building. And that's kind of allowed the building to be lifted up. The campus becomes very porous. It also becomes a way to, exhibition spaces, etc., comes at the ground floor. It becomes a way to kind of meet with that larger campus. And that is where that, the idea of those three different scales that come in. So we started actually with a recliner box. We realized that we did an atrium. We realized that it's not kind of creating the spaces that it ties together. And then we staggered that kind of section to be able to allow that campus which comes in to kind of almost create this diagonal courtyard or diagonal vertical courtyard, you know. So if I take this section and flip it as a plan, it's still a diagonal courtyard, but you're almost kind of creating not an open to sky, but an open to sides. So in many sense, it's a new kind of reconfiguration of the traditional figure ground relationship. And this for us is the most interesting part of exploring or working within this new challenging context that I talked at the beginning, is to kind of look at new possibilities of kind of looking at new relationships. And now for us, it's also a way to kind of how do one then start to engage with the academics. I often say that, you know, our practice is not about, we are not engaged in practicing a particular theory that we learn, but our role as practitioner is to go into the world and look at new theoretical framework, which we can then take it as learning and kind of start to influence the academics, and or kind of inform the academics rather, to be able to kind of see that. And this is what Palasma also talks about when he talks about the self and the world. Every project that we do is a bit of us and a bit of our understanding of the world. And it's extremely important that we constantly learn about the world as we go along. There is nothing fixed in this world, and more so in today's times that we live in, where you find a new socio-economic political context every 5 or 10 years, to which you need to respond as architects and designers and problem solvers. And it's very important that we constantly learn about the world to be able to respond to that. So for us, what is most interesting about engaging with these challenging contexts is to kind of figure out these new possibilities or new kind of ways of making these new relationship between the figure and the ground. And hence, how do you kind of then start to teach these relationship? How can these relationship then start to become building bylaws? In other words, if you look at this, it has only one, it has only a figure, it doesn't have a ground. Now the ground is within the figure in this particular case. Now how do I kind of then teach the way I traditionally teach a figure ground relationship? If you look at our building bylaws, it says that open space have to be left on a percentage of the land and has nothing to do with density. So I can do a 1 FSI project in a land, or a 10 FSI project in a land. My open space requirement is the same. It's the 10% of the land and not the 10% of the density that one needs to build. Now, if I have to do the 10% of the density, it should be about the density. Should not be about the land. And if it is about the density, how do then I how do I kind of achieve this new requirement of a larger open space or a social space requirement, unless I start to kind of figure out these new relationship between the figure and the ground? And these projects in some sense became a great opportunity for us to explore that. So this is again some of the diagrams which talks about how the campus kind of flows through it, and then it kind of goes vertically up. So suddenly you create this new relationship or a new courtyard, which is sort of this diagonal vertical open to side courtyard within that building. And that then start to kind of make the building extremely light. So each floor plate in some sense has a courtyard. Right? If I take the plan of each floor, there is a courtyard, and that courtyard then staggers, and then they start to kind of make that relationship. And this is a different way of creating that relationship I talked about at the beginning, which is that collective realm, which is the idea of the private, the semi-public, and the public, and where all of them kind of come together, or the blurred boundaries between all of them. In this case, the campus being the larger public, the Department of Architecture being the sort of the semi-public, the floor in which I am situated being the private, and I start to kind of make that relationship between the figure and the ground and kind of create a collective realm. And the sense of identity that one we create, the sense of belonging that we have, is often tied to kind of creating these kind of relationship between the private, public, and semi-public through those blurred boundaries. The other key aspect that we did is that we sculpted this space within the building, but we also kind of staggered them in a way that the one of the wings overhangs into the other one on the southern side, so that the space is protected from the harsh sun, but also allows the wind to kind of flow through it. So that entire mass is kind of sliding down to kind of almost cantilevering 8 feet to kind of offer shade to those spaces that is created and respond to the climate. These are set of the plan diagrams which talks about that. This is what I said, each floor has a courtyard which then staggers up and down. The ground floor is left open as an exhibition space with a little courtyard there. So it becomes an extension of the larger campus. And then as you go up, these spaces start to kind of stagger up. And there is at the seventh floor, there is a larger public space. And within the studio space, these are the studio spaces. We plugged in a sort of a model making space. So it's kind of self-sustaining. One third of it becomes a double height space. And that's the section. So you can see that relationship between the figure and the ground. These were some of the views which were conceptualized. That's the built work. The project is complete now. It's completely occupied. And you can see each of these courtyards, which are open to the sides, which opens into the larger forest, and the wind is flowing through that direction. And so even if I'm in a seventh floor, I feel extremely light, and I almost feel like I'm in the ground because I'm in a constant negotiation or constant relationship to that ground within that. And this is also a way for us to kind of organize that density in a way that one makes it extremely light and without really losing that relationship to that ground. And then this is the courtyard, I'd say at the sixth floor or something. And this is the cantilever, which kind of shades that entire space. This is ground floor, which is left completely open. That's the front. So you kind of, I mean, you are not, you never experience that space unless you kind of come into that building and it just explodes into that courtyard. Almost in that sort of the blurred relationship in a sort of a traditional configuration of a figure ground. That's how it's seen. Again, most of these buildings, the idea becomes the expression as well, and it gets expressed in the sort of becomes a language or the sort of that determines a sort of the character for that building. This is the student activity center. Again, the idea of stitching that campus back into the this thing. This is also a response to the context within which we practice today. We realize that nobody wants to do a site plan, master plan today because no one plans early, right? I mean, though she took some 20 years to do the IIM Bangalore, you're never going to get a client who comes and tells you that I have 20 years to design this building. So it's extremely important to understand the context within which we practice today. And unless we embrace that and engage with that, we are not able to find new tools to kind of respond to that. And I feel that unless we identify these or engage with these challenges and the complexities that comes with the context within which we practice today, we are not able to provide solutions that kind of then becomes meaningful and engage with the kind of the way we live today. So so no client comes and tells I need to do a master plan and I'll plan one after the they build. Most of the universities are also today driven by private money and borrowed money, and hence they all come to you when there is a dire need for a building. And so it's so for us it was very important to look at these buildings as a way to constantly stitch the campus together. So we are constantly looking at what that building do to that larger campus when it all matures, and that kind of drove the kind of thinking within that. It's not the idea of designing that one building or that object, but what is the relationship that object to the larger campus that it sets in. So that then, in this particular case, again, the ground floor, the eating area is completely left open on the sides. The outside space kind of flows into that, and that's kind of it is conceptualized. The project hasn't started yet. It just becomes an extension of that public space outside. And these are all the sections put together. They don't sit in the campus like this, but just to show that how each of these buildings are then kind of fragmented in a way that it is a set of ideas or set of goals and objectives in many ways, and not driven by the idea of an object, but the idea of how one kind of what is the relationship between the campus to those buildings and how one needs to kind of engage with that particular building. I think I have 15 more minutes.
Yes, sir.
So I'll talk a little bit about the housing projects that we are doing here. And these are some of the projects that we've been engaged, housing projects we've been engaged for the past few years. And it's probably one of the most toughest typologies we have engaged with. And Here, Korea says that with urbanizations, architects have a larger role to play in conceptualizing new growth options. There is much more to housing than building houses. The room is only one element in a whole system of spaces which a family needs in order to live in a city. And for us, a lot of our thinking, especially with regard to housing or our attitude towards cities, is also driven by many of Korea's projects and Korea's writings. More importantly, and here when he and we don't think anybody has dealt with housing more brilliantly than Korea did. And one of the reasons he is able to do it is that he kind of understood that typology very. Um, uh, he understood the importance of typology and the criticality of it. And he often says that if you are practicing in India, you need to have housing in your portfolio, and because that is the most important typology that one needs to deal with when you engage in a context like in India. But the context is completely different from where he practiced. So it becomes even more challenging. And for us, when we started engaging with this housing projects a few years back, we were very conscious of the fact that it could suck you up, and it really kind of throw you up, and really one needs to really kind of push ourselves to be able to engage with this, to deal with the kind of challenging sort of the typology that we need to deal with. And it comes down to what he told here is that one needs to look at this unit as just one of the critical aspect of one needs to live in a city, and hence there is a huge difference between housing and a house. And in a house, what you call as home is what your unit is in many sense, because you have all the social spaces that you need within your compound wall. But when you deal with housing, that unit is only one component, and what you call as a home is your community and not just your unit. And hence it's very important to understand that, when you talk about housing, you if you want to make it a home, you need to design communities, and you have to kind of create that idea of shared living, or celebrate that idea of shared living to be able to make housing successful. And the sustainability of housing comes from the idea of kind of creating these shared living, celebratory, in many sense. And that unit then becomes one component of it. And most of our housing today are actually about that unit, because our developers sell floor plans, and hence there is so much emphasis on that one unit, with 10 by 10, 10 by 12 feet, etc., etc., that you buy and sell square footages, and you're not buying or selling a community or a home. And that makes the context even more challenging, because you need to able to kind of engage with these various challenges that comes with that this typology. Housing has become one of the most challenging typologies post liberalization. Most of the housing developments are in private hands today, which means that it is the impatient money that decides the nature of housing developments, especially in urban contexts. The idea of social most often is ignored in these economic calculations. Hence, housing developments are reduced to mere creation of objects with parking. Families need more than parking to live, they need social infrastructure. Hence, a true sustainable housing development should take into account the need to access to parks, amenities, schools, hospitals, etc. If we don't think about all these social needs, we are just piling up rooms one over the other. It's critical that we understand and optimize all parameters, not just the act of building more housing in order to create sustainable cities. As Korea used to say, the issue is not how high the building can go, but what goes within that building. I think this is some of the thinking that we have. This is Korea again, who says that one needs about 22 square meters of social spaces to be able to live in a city. And he says that about 10 of it, you should be 10 to 12 square meters of it, you should find in the larger context. That's your schools, your hospitals, etc. But another 10 to 12 square feet you need to be able to provide within a walking radius of where you live. And in most of the larger development, it's about within the building that you live in. And if you look at your larger context, many of these things are missing already, and it makes it even more challenging. And like I said earlier, our open spaces regulations are tied to the land and not to the density. And hence, as we build more and more dense, we are building less and less open space. So how do we then kind of design these buildings in a way that you are able to kind of achieve that 10 to 12 square meters of open space or a social space per person within the developments that one needs to engage in. So when we do housing projects, we often ask these questions: are we creating spaces for congregation? And these are what we start to look to do in every housing projects that we do. Are we creating spaces for celebration? Are we creating spaces that inculcate values? It creates a sense of belonging, identity, and is it vibrant enough so that it allows people to come together and celebrate the idea of shared living? This is a project which is nearing completion now in Trivandrum. It's called the Rainforest. One of the most challenging FSIs that you have to deal with is in Kerala, because Kerala has, in many sense, I think the highest in the country. It's about 4.5 FSI. It's very strange why it is. We don't know. So, but it also presented us with a great opportunity to explore this notion of density and kind of idea of social spaces. So this particular project is right at the heart of the city. This is the Raj Bhavan with all the green spaces that you can see around it. And that's what is marked in red is the site. And as you go up, you will see a lot of, you know, wonderful views of the larger context. But what was challenging was that, you know, immediately next to the site were all these 10, 12, 13 floors buildings right next to the site, almost abetting the site itself. And the site currently is a void. So we realize that if you start to build the traditional way, it just becomes an urban jungle, and it kind of takes away that void that already exists there. And all you are left with is, you know, as you one comes there, your experience becomes of these massive buildings kind of staring at your face, and it becomes challenging to kind of create any kind of contextual relationship. So what we have done is that in this particular case, when we started, we were, you know, we could go up to 20, 25-story buildings. So what we said is that what we look to do is we started kind of organizing density from the top, because our contextual buildings were all largely 10 and 12 stories. So when we started, you know, organizing the density from the top, which offered greater views of the larger context, we realized by the time we reached the third and the fourth floor, we were able to achieve all the density that were required to be built in that site. And that what that did is also that it left the entire site as a void. And we got this humongous void within the site, which we then just left it as a park. So the entire site then becomes a park. The unit starts at the third and the fourth floor, and the site already was dropping about 10 meters from the existing road. So we kind of tucked in all the parking, and that park becomes at the same level as the road, almost like an extension of the road in many sense. And it becomes a wonderful community space then, in which you know, one start to live in. So when you come into the community, you are actually coming in through a park. Only the lobbies come down and the reception area comes down, and some amenities which kind of activate that park. So we were essentially designing a park within which these buildings or these units lived in. Now this is again the similar kind of that figure ground relationship that I talked about earlier, where the ground is actually within the figure, and it is a new relationship of that traditional figure ground relationship, and which able to kind of achieve the need or the kind of social spaces one otherwise needs to be able to achieve to live in a context like this. And of course, we look to maximize these social spaces by creating many of these at multiple levels. We always say that, you know, the land is constant, but the ground is a relationship, and one can constantly multiply the ground. So even though we are short of land, we can create multiple grounds, because the ground is about relationship. It's about that relationship to the program or the activities. So the land can remain fixed. And it is in many sense a legal term. It has nothing to do with relationship, while the ground is about that creating that relationship. And our effort or endeavor is to constantly create these multiple grounds to be able to make life more richer and create these kind of social spaces. So what this is that the larger, the top view, all the taller units kind of started obviously opening up to the larger context, opening into the park, which is a Raj Bhavan, etc. What it also did is that it started to create a new context for the lower units. So what we did is that each of these units, we kind of stopped at different levels, and they were designed in a way that they were almost like standalone stacked up units. It started to create these pockets of views, vistas into that park, which is created below. So you not only created a context to respond to for the top units, but this new context that you created then becomes a way to kind of engage with the units at the lower level. And interestingly, what it did also is that it actually created a void or a park view for the neighbors as well. So suddenly they also kind of start to now look into that, especially the lower units look into that park. And what is beautiful in a climate like Kerala is like, when it rains, you can be in that space. It's almost like a community veranda, which is, in a traditional Kerala setting, you will have these verandas within your house. And how do you then, kind of create these community verandas? So one can just go there and stand there and enjoy the rain falling, sit there, sip a coffee. It creates this wonderful space to be engaged with that context more fruitfully and creatively. And this becomes, we call it a rainforest. So the idea is to really lush and create sort of a larger, almost like a forest within that. And also, what is interesting is that what we call as a reverse skyline, it start to kind of create that because of the way it is articulated. It start to do that, and that's the some of the views from the initial conceptualization. All the slabs are so every unit ends up with 4 columns, which comes down. Everything gets transferred at a transfer slab. Even the services gets transferred at that level. And what you see is this park at the ground level with only 4 columns per unit kind of coming down. That's the sort of the scale of the project, and these are how the units were articulated. So you can get, I mean, it's in almost 11 floors are done. You can see the scale. That's Kishore, my partner. I often use him. You can see the scale of the project because he's about 6.5 feet tall. I joke about it when I show this. It's a nice scale relationship, and he is kind of spearheading, getting all these things done. So you can see the scale of the project, scale of that space, excuse me, to which one kind of open up, and it just becomes a park. It opens into the other side as well, and this is where one enters. This is another project which is almost complete now. Again, very close to that other rainforest that I talked about. This is in fact right at that Vellayampalam junction. It's in the heart of the city. It's one of the most prominent junctions of the city. What is critical about this context is that almost 180 degrees of this context is preserved as 3 and 4 story institutional buildings, and this is the first site where the height is allowed. So once you go down, you will actually see many taller buildings, but this is the first site where the height is allowed. So suddenly you get a context which is largely kind of in some sense 3 or 4 stories, and at a critical junction you get to kind of create a building which is extremely taller, which we feel urbanistically is very important because it really anchors that particular junction, because the other end of the street is the secretariat. So this one particular junction really gets anchored by that tall element at an urban level. But we also know that we need to then relate to that ground level experience, or because it has these wonderful street activities, pedestrian sidewalks, etc. How do one kind of respond to that in a way that engage with that in a way one can relate to as a scale? So we looked at sort of vertical configurations of building a community. So you can see the larger context and the relationship to that new building when you pop it up, and you see that scale, and in many sense that's the relationship. So you can see at an urban level it creates that sort of the marker or a sort of identity for that junction, but it's also about how one then negotiate that relationship at the ground, or the experience at the ground of the street and the street activities. And if you look at the context, what you see generally is that there are these 3 story, 4 story buildings, and then there is a swath of green, and there is another 3 story, 4 story buildings. So what we try to articulate is that what if we sort of look at the horizontal structure of the city, of these green and the figure and the green, the 3 and 4 story buildings and the green space, and how can we then translate that vertically up? And that was our exploration in this particular project, is to break down that scale of that building vertically up, almost kind of taking clues from the sort of the analyzing the structure of that context of the horizontal section of that context, and almost kind of vertically translating in. So what it did is that you kind of create these clusters of 3 and 4 stories with an in-between green or a community space plugged in between. What was also critical for us is also to kind of engage with that ground level. So what we did is that we have a retail piece, which is a one-story mast, which kind of comes out and engage with the street, and the taller mast then push back. So when you walk on the street, you're already relating to that one-story mast, or even at best, even the four-story or five-story mast, and the rest of the mast then hovers back around you. So when at a pedestrian level, you're constantly relating to a scale which then relates to that larger context, while at a larger level, at an urbanistic, it start to kind of define that particular junction. And that kind of drove the thinking of how one kind of start to organize this building, and that led to the kind of the section and kind of articulating this building in a way. So these are programmatically, you kind of see the commercial activities activating that streetscape and kind of getting plugged in. There are amenities above that, housing amenities. So it kind of created that section. So that's how it is conceptualized. There are a lot of balconies all around with louvers, which one can kind of open and shut, depending on how do you want to kind of, as an inhabitant, how you want to engage with the larger context. And you see these breaks in the building, which are then clusters to kind of green community spaces. It becomes after every 3 or 4 floors. That's kind of how it is conceptual. So, we see this kind of a relationship in the night. You can see it almost like these horizontal structure of the city in a very abstract way being kind of represented in a vertical manner. Looks at the building is almost complete now. You can see this is the ground floor retail, which kind of comes out and kind of engage with the street itself, and the rest of the building in a very thin manner kind of goes up and kind of do that. So this is what I was saying. So this is before that ground floor was built. So when you walk on the street, what you relate to is that kind of a volume with the one story. When the one story comes out, all you see is that kind of a relationship. You will never kind of, in some sense, experience that because there are a lot of trees all around it. Only from a larger distance or on the other side of the junction, you start to kind of perceive this building, and hence you kind of start to make that relationship at a level. I'll end with this last project. I think it's about time. This is another project which is nearing completion. Again, a housing project in Bangalore. A very interesting project. It's just off of Indiranagar in a neighborhood called C.V. Raman Nagar, very close to the Bayapanalli metro station. That's the site. This is the station within 400 meters from the metro station. And when you go to the site, this is what you see. I mean, it's and these are the sort of the complexities and contradictions that comes with every engagement, with every project that we do in an urban context. And one can't ignore this, right? When you go into the site, you are faced with new challenges every time. So it's left to us whether we want to engage with it or whether we want to kind of get away from it. And this was extremely challenging because this site had these huge, really 150-year-old banyan trees, rain trees, and many other trees within the site. And how do you kind of negotiate a site like this when you have to do in sort of an urban building, which is almost 12 stories and 2.5 FSI? And you almost start to, in some sense, dream like this and say, we don't want to just preserve the trees. Of course, that is important, but we also want to kind of make that experience, people who occupy this building to really experience that, continue to experience those trees, because we feel that sustainability doesn't come with just preservation. Sustainability comes with engaging with things, and whether it's a tree or whether it's a preserved building, unless we constantly engage with that, it doesn't become part of our life, and it doesn't become part of our lifestyle, and it doesn't get connected to our memories. It doesn't connected to our culture and the lifestyles that we have. And the moment it gets connected to our memory and our lifestyle, then we argue we want to kind of preserve them. And I think that's the most critical aspect of it. So when we started looking at it, the first thought obviously was to kind of how do one kind of engage with it. And then what we started is we plotted the trees and we started to literally carve around this building, the building around the trees, the larger trees. Luckily, most of the larger trees were on the peripheries. There was already an existing house there which got torn down, so most of this site was empty. Some of the trees which were here got replanted. Quite a few have, most of it has survived. But the idea was to kind of really carve around these existing trees to be able to and see if we can make the density work. And that then led to the kind of the to the conceptualization of that project. So, and then it was not just about, like I said, not about preserving the tree, but it's also about how do one kind of then start to kind of experience that tree, so each of these units then start to kind of design in a way that it opens into that tree. So it almost become like my house and my tree, that kind of a relationship. And this is again a sort of a complete abstract relationship, way of looking at what I talked about, that collective realm, right at the beginning. Here I'm starting to connect to that tree, and that my one unit becomes suddenly part of that larger collective realm, and so each unit then designed individually, designed in a way that bedroom, living room, dining, etc., opens up into that tree and start to engage with that. And there are 4 units in a core. So what we have done is also to avoid the corridor that cuts across, we created 2 cores, which serves two units. And that what that did is that it allowed us to have these units completely cross ventilated, almost like a house, which is kind of nothing on both sides, completely cross ventilated, and opens up with each, create this direct relationship that tree. And the ground is again left open, double height volume. All the most of the parking were taken to the basement right at the beginning. So when you come in, you just go directly to the ground, to the basement, so that the rest of the driveway, even the fire driveway, remains a public realm. It is not used unless there is an emergency. So it is designed in a way that it becomes a public space. There's no constant movement of the traffic, at least on both these sides. There are some vehicular, the visitor parking here. Most of the 99% of the parking goes, requirement goes into the basement. And the entire ground is left to experience these trees at a double height volume. So there are certain amenity spaces which are plugged in again to activate that tree. Like there is a reading space here which opens into the banyan court. There's a rain tree here. There are some play areas which kind of opens into it. So it's also about fragmenting those amenities in a way that it start to activate these spaces. So this is that reading space which opens into the banyan tree. And that's the layout. So each unit is completely cross ventilated with a core tucked in between, and all of them kind of opens into a tree cluster and make that relationship. And even the roof is activated with a pool and other community spaces, and again multiplying that ground and looking to multiply that ground. And we constantly look at, when we engage with the site, not to lose that land, but to kind of figure out a way to kind of multiply that relationship of the ground, or the land in a ground form, creating more relationship. So that's the elevation. It's again a very simple building. I mean, it just responds to that tree, and that then becomes the expression of the building, where the trees hum within that curve. We have these louvers because it's all balconies opening up. And because it's a curve, there are certain privacy issues that louvers then kind of gives ones the flexibility to again open and close the way you want to engage with that trees. But more importantly, at a larger contextual level, that louvers then becomes almost frames those trees. It's like a painting with a backdrop, creating a backdrop to that to those trees in a very very abstract way. And that's how the building is envisioned to it. It kind of responds and really kind of carves around those trees. The building is almost complete, at least the structure is complete. You can see extremely challenging for the team getting it done. I mean, it's, you know, most of the trees have to be taken. Some of the trees grows into that, a lot of challenges because, some trees start at the ground level at one position, and by the time we cast the slab at the fifth level, you realize that the tree is coming into this thing. And because of the way today's bylaws are written, you can't change the floor plans. And once you have sold, you can't, RERA gets kicks in and you get challenged if you change the floor plan. Somebody who bought it could sue you. So there are many of these kind of challenges that one needs to deal with when you deal with housing as a typology. And it is not as flexible as the context within which one practiced, say, 20, 25 years ago, and to be able to engage it. And one needs to constantly provide solutions as and when things arises and challenges comes in, and to be able to kind of still continue to build meaningfully and continue to protect many of the things that are critical. We no longer live in a world of unlimited land resources. Buildings without a relationship to the land cannot continue to become the norm. Cities are increasingly becoming a collection of objects with little concern for their relationship to each other or the larger idea of the city. Spaces left between them have become undesirable and inhabitable. Cities need squares, parks, walkways, and spaces for children, places integral to community life that encourage human interaction and sharing of pleasant experiences. We must develop a sensitivity to public space in urban and suburban environments where the space between is becoming more important as densities increase. Our neighborhoods have become unhealthy places to live and work, islands of life isolated in wastelands of space. There has to be an organic relationship between buildings, people, sidewalk, open space, and parks, not just isolated buildings rising up. The challenges that we face today with our needs for housing, we will need high density, but we also need an intense use of the land. The cities of the future cannot be or should not be just dense. It has to be connected and walkable. And I'll end with this wonderful quote from Korea from his lecture in London in 83 called The Place in the Sun. He says that we are only as big as the questions we address. And this, to my mind, is a central riveting fact of life for architects in the third world. Not the size or the value of the projects that we are working on, but the nature of the questions that they raise and which we must confront. A chance to grow the abiding virtue of a place in the sun. Thank you.
Hi, Biju. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your work with us. It was amazing journey. Actually, Biju means jewel in French. You actually did this century, spoke for 100 minutes, but we wanted more run from you. You covered everything from urban institutes, housing, everything. Yeah. So my first question to you is, do you remember when was the first you thought about studying architecture? And apart from this, any childhood memories which you can share?
So, well, I don't know how I had this. I mean, when I was in maybe in the ninth or tenth, I had this obsession with architecture. I don't know. My father was a civil engineer, and he used to design a lot of houses. And I don't know. Maybe from there, I got obsessed with architecture. I actually got into naval architecture right after my 12th. I joined Navy to do naval architecture, and for some reason, called from Bombay, and that is because of these new schools starting, and that's how I moved to Bombay, applied, and kind of got in. And that's where my journey started. And I mean, I don't think I was a great student at all. And most of the say, I have to say that most of our learnings comes through the practice that we do. And I think what we had some wonderful teachers who taught us, you know, not necessarily great things about just architecture, but to look at life in a very challenging manner. Constantly try to search things. And we had Akhtar Chavan, of course, was a principal for us with all the 5 years. It can't get tougher than that. And then we had people like Masood Taj, Salil Randive, who were great, who are at their peak in many sense, have really inspired us. And more importantly, in some ways we had Doshi, Korea, and all of them, practicing at their peak, and we had inspirations all around, which drove us, and that is kind of where our journey started. But a lot of the learnings comes from the projects that we do, and I don't think, and we constantly, with every talk that I give or someone gives, we constantly look at what is it that comes out of, or what is it that we learned from the practice that we do, and constantly try and kind of make meaning out of it. Because when you do a project, some of things are intuitive. I mean, it is what you believe in which comes intuitively. It's not that everything is through planned. Like Palasma says that there is conscious intuition and unconscious. There's unconscious intuition and conscious intellect. All right, and when you do a project, You get these when you go to a site, you get these unconscious intuitions, but then you come to the studio and start to analyze and bring in the conscious intellect. And then you are starting to challenge through a process of design. You're starting to kind of question what you got is intuitively, whether it fits in there or not. And you challenge it with your conscious research, or intellect. And then eventually it is the survival of the fittest. The idea that survives is the fittest. So it's really the process that drives it, and the learning comes from that process.
What was it like to study in Mumbai, away from your hometown? Who were your inspirations or heroes while studying architecture? And did it change after a few years?
Yeah, I already touched upon. Korea was a great inspiration. I can't think of a greater inspiration than Korea is. Not just his body of work. Of course, what he did with housing is remarkable. And I don't think anybody in the world has handled the housing waste the way he has done. And what is more important for me is that every time you look at Korea's work, it is not his work itself was a great teaching about what comes forward. I remember listening to a lecture from Frampton at Columbia in 2002, and he started this his lecture by saying that the urban world has grown exactly the way Indian architect Charles Correa predicted 20 years ago, much to his dislike. In the sense that Korea had this amazing ability to understand that I believe in certain things, but I know that the world is not going to grow the way I believe, because the forces that acts upon the world are much more than who we are as architects, right? And hence he constantly through his work threw these solutions out, right? You look at Kanchenjunga, it was built in the early 80s. He never believed in a density like that, a taller density. More, he believed in a more dense horizontal density in many sense, tight, dense, of course, but in a very more European kind of a density. But here he knew that India is going to grow in a vertical way, and that's the only way we could grow. So he was through that project, he was actually demonstrating that if you have to build vertically, there is a good way to build vertically. And you learn from me. And that building, which was built in the early 80s, still stands tall, right? Among many of the high rises that is built, uh, you know, 40 years, 50 years later after that. Look at the mall that he built in Calcutta. Now, as an urban designer, a mall is one of the most challenging typologies. Nobody would recommend a mall in a city, right? But he knew that is what the aspirations of the people are. So he was actually through that project demonstrating if you have to build a mall, there is a better way of building a mall, which still kind of takes into account what we need to live in a city. So for us, that is what practice does to us. For us, it is about engaging with this challenging context that comes with where we practice today, and try and engage with them. Some may be successful, some may not be, but it presents us great opportunity to explore new possibilities.
You have spent long time studying and working in New York. Can you elaborate on that?
So New York, yeah, studying was okay. I don't, you know, most of the masters are, at least when I studied, it was 2 years. Today it is 1 year. I don't know. I don't know how much of you can learn in 1 year of a master's program, but the learning really came from being part of the city of New York. I've practiced there for almost 10 years, as a director with a large firm there, primarily looking at large urban design projects. And for me, most of my learnings came from that, kind of looking at density, looking at creating social spaces, how do one kind of engage with public realm, etc. All these kind of learnings comes from engaging with the city of New York, and a lot of the large scale projects I was lucky enough to work on. And that's what I carried with me while I moved back and set up the practice with Kishore, who was my classmate as well. And both of them just believed in many sense. We are quite different, but our goals and objectives and values are same. And that makes the practice a lot more fruitful, and richer and more collaborative in many sense.
Thank you, Biju. I will ask Tanay to take questions from audience.
Yes, thank you, Girish sir. Uh, Before I even start asking questions, I have to mention this that this was really an interesting and knowledge sharing experience through the presentation that you have shared with all of us. We had almost like 250 to 300 participants like all together with Zoom and YouTube together. I think so. We have few questions for you from the audience. I'll start with one question. It is asked by Prasad Patil. How to balance vertical growth and horizontal growth in process of sustainable approach? What range we need to set to limit this growth in controlled manner? And will that range lead us to dead city? So that is his question.
So through the presentation, what in some ways what I was also trying to talk about is the fact that there are a lot of critical issues when it comes to the way we plan or the way we make our policies. Especially with regard to our building bylaws, I constantly talked about the fact that it doesn't take into account the density, and our regulations are all written primarily on the land and has nothing to do with. So there are many challenges that comes in that way. So unless those policies change, and we need to constantly engage with policymakers to be able to influence that and to be able to constantly demonstrate that, we will not be able to kind of create cities which are meaningful, planned, organized, etc., etc. The growth will be inorganic in many sense. Now, for our exploration, in many sense, is also what are the new possibilities that exist within this inorganic, because there is a lot of meaning even in that inorganic organization of our cities. Our cities are extremely in many sense, our cities are sustainable because mere density is there, to a large extent. And because of the fact that, in some sense, the person who works in your house lives maybe in a slum in a below your building, is actually a sustainable way of living. But we need to make sure that hygienic conditions within that slum needs to be taken care of. We need to create healthy environments for them to live. So our cities in some sense are, many components of what many cities that need density, etc., is already there, right? So what we need to constantly do is to engage with it and try and, in an incremental way, try and kind of throw out possibilities, and parallelly work with policymakers to be able to influence master planning processes, etc., etc. So and both of them has its own merits and advantages and fascination. I always quote this line from Dorchi, who wrote a book called The Power of the Limits. And in that he says that with our fascination with invention, we often forget about the power of the limits, right? And this is what we have faced up today. We are all fascinated with invention. We want to talk about startups. We want to talk about, we all want to invent new things today, right? That's what our aspiration is driving to. But we forget that these limits that is around us presents us with the greatest of opportunities, right? And the most creative place one can come in is the most challenging context. And for me, India is like that. Practicing in India is like that. It is the greatest of all labs, right? And to be able to engage with that context and to be able to constantly look for solutions for those challenging contexts is the most creative thing that one can do. And so we need to engage with that limits. We need to embrace those limits and don't look at it as a negative, but as an opportunity to be able to. I mean, what else you need as a creative person to be able to, challenge you with, worst of issues, so that you can then find solutions. So we need to kind of come into that mindset to be able to engage and embrace those limits, to be able to find in that solutions. And I don't think there is any other better context than practicing in urban India to find a more challenging context.
Definitely. With that challenge being into a question, today we have a situation which is quite challenging, and we have a question from our audience, an anonymous question. So the question is related to the COVID outbreak. So the question goes is, how do we look forward to the public, semi-public and private space relationships considering the changed dynamics of human activities due to the COVID-19 outbreak?
Yeah, so this is, when COVID happened, this was probably one of the most critical things I thought about it at the beginning. It's that it hits you right at the core of everything that you believes in, right? It hits you. The idea of urban living is about shared living, right? And if you take that idea of social spaces and shared living out, then there is no sustainability in urban living, right? So first of all, I strongly believe this is temporal, right? And I don't think this is something that, because we are social animals at the end of the day. And even then, even the early 2000 or late 1990s, when the digital revolution happened and the Y2K happened, everybody thought that, we are no more going to work. We are all going to work from home, and we don't need social spaces, but we have virtual spaces. But nothing happened. I think it's human nature that we socialize, right? I don't think, so we are hopefully all going to come out of it and start to kind of engage in cities much more fruitfully than we've been doing. But there are tremendous opportunities that this presented to us. This was like a mirror. It was like a pause moment. You could start to look at what all we were doing wrong. Suddenly we know that our cities can survive with less cars. We know that our environment is better, right? We know that we can work digitally. We don't need to be traveling all the time. Like when we do all these projects in Bangalore and Trivandrum, we were constantly traveling every week, like putting pressure on ourselves, putting pressure on, spending a lot of energy, all these things. We know that, this was, although all these facilities were available then, we never took advantage of it or looked up to it. Now, when this happened, it suddenly opened up this whole set of opportunities, or allowed us to look at what we were doing wrong, and to be able to then, hopefully, when we come out of it, start to put all these into practice. And that's, for me, is the greatest of learnings that could come out of this. And I don't think otherwise it's going to impact majorly the way we live or way we interact with people. But we should learn, and we should see what we can take from this, and whatever positives that came out of it needs to be implemented as well.
Right. So the next question is from architect Virendra Vaklu, who is also one of the speakers in this 8 days, 8 cities, 8 architects series. So the question that architect Virendra Vaklu wants to ask is, first of all, he wants to thank you for the wonderful presentation and redefining the role and the responsibilities of an architect in today's context. Does India's land share of 2% measure against habitable land available globally, or the Earth's land surface? So that is his question.
No, yeah, it's purely the earth availability. So which also means that if India has a lot of areas which are ecologically sensitive, right? That even makes it
Right.
even more challenging going forward with our population. So that, that is why we are constantly putting and encroaching upon this. Now one needs to start to mandate and differentiate these areas which are ecologically sensitive and which are taken away today, right? And the moment you kind of start to differentiate that, that pressure becomes even more. And that is why we need to kind of even look at bylaws in a way that one can creatively resolve this issue of density, and to be able to kind of create meaningful sustainable communities. So he's right. It is not it's the measure of the land. It's not just the habitable land, it's a measure of the overall land. So
Yeah. So with this idea of you mentioning the scarcity of land also that we have when it comes to cities, and Kerala, as you mentioned, having 4 FSI. So how do you see? You also mentioned about suburban and the urban areas being together and developing. So how do we look at, with this migrant population shifting back and coming forth to the cities and continuous exchange happening? Can we look at, in your opinion, can we look at it in future, that these rural or peri-urban areas being transformed through the perspective of not overcrowding the cities?
yeah, of course. That's one of the greatest opportunities that COVID threw at us. The possibilities that it is showing it to us, that you don't really need to be in the urban areas. You can actually go and strengthen the rural areas, right? Or the peri-urban areas, in a way that you don't really need to put that pressure onto the urban land as much as you need to have. Which means that, I may have my office, 20 kilometers away from the city, and I may need to come to the city only when I need to or engage with it, right? I can then start to work with the local ecology, local economics, etc., and try and kind of, bring in that economy back to the rural areas. I think this is, but at the end of the day, a lot of these things have to be driven by policy thinking. And we as architects and planners can only throw out possibilities and kind of start to inform them, but eventually it has to be driven by policy thinking, because what happens today in an urban India is that cities are these huge money making pockets, right? I mean, and
Right.
and that's why I talked about at the beginning, our cities are not about collective realm. It is a set of plots subdivided, and that is how we write our bylaws. How do I create value to my plot, right? And what is my buildability within my plot, right? And
Right.
that is how our bylaws are written. It is a set of subdivisions, and it is not a set of a collective realm where one needs to engage it. So we need to have a complete different way of engaging with the sort of the building bylaws, building regulations, and there are many possibilities that can emerge from it. The challenging thing is that it is a long drawn process, and one needs to be able to patient and be have the vision to kind of draw, be driven by that. I mean, I think we tried to attempt to do Amravati in 2 years, right? Look where we are today,
Yeah.
right? We need to understand that city building is not an overnight process, especially when you engage with new city existing cities, right? It has to have a certain kind of an engagement with the larger community. It has to be a process driven. It can't be a top down approach. It has to be uh, uh, it can't be completely bottom up either. It has to be a process which has both top down and bottom up approach driven together in many sense. And that patience, because of our aspirations, we don't have that patience today, and to be able to kind of drive it in the right way. Nor do our leaders have that vision, because what happens with every state government or every central government is the vision is set for the 5 years,
Yeah.
right? Vision is not set for the next 20 years,
Right.
right? You are working with election cycles, and you need to be able to, you want to kind of show something which is tangible at the end of that election cycle, to be able to again ask for votes and showing that. And
Yeah.
that is not how cities are built,
Right.
right?
So the next question we have from Stavan Gandhi. Because of insufficient parking spaces in buildings which are built in 80s or 90s, common open spaces in spaces become parking areas, but which supposed to serve as a recreational space instead. What do you think? How to solve it? Because of insufficient parking spaces. Okay, so sorry, he has again did the same thing. I'll just read the question once again, probably if you not understood it properly. So the question is, because of insufficient parking spaces in buildings, common open spaces become parking areas, but which supposed to serve as recreational spaces instead. So the question is, what do you think, or
So yeah,
what do
I
you think? How
understand
to
the
solve it?
So I think this is
Yeah.
where one of the things that we are doing with the initial set of projects that I talked about, and I stress so much on the public participation in that process of making those spaces, is exactly this: is that when you build cities, when you build public spaces, you need to kind of engage with the people, the real stakeholders who are going to occupy that space, and you engage them and make them part of your design process, make them part of your making process. Then they take ownership of that space. Like we designed a street here a few years back, and where there was a 3-lane traffic, we took away, and we, over analyzing, we realized that only one lane takes the traffic, and both the other lanes are essentially conflicts. And we actually reduced the traffic lane to just one and created larger sidewalks. and and one person constantly started creating nuisances, and he called and threatened us and said, you have taken my parking away, etc., and we've kind of told corporation to kind of call for a community meeting, and we had a community meeting where we actually explained to them all these things. And we realized that the person who created the problem is only one person, right? But he had the biggest voice, and the rest of the community actually liked the idea of a larger sidewalk. right? And what happened then is that then they started taking ownership of that sidewalk. So if somebody then comes and if I have a shop and having a larger sidewalk definitely increase my business as a shopkeeper. Right now, if I make that shopkeeper as a stakeholder, part of that making process of that sidewalk, tomorrow somebody comes and parks a car in that sidewalk, he will definitely come out and say, don't park there. And that is what an ownership is. And that is why it's critical when we build cities, we make people who has an ownership of the city part of that making process. And unless we kind of translate or create a process through which we engage with that, it will always be challenging. These kind of issues will always be there. And that sense of community needs to be built in through the process of making. And this is also what indirectly I was telling through that first project that where we built that community, where somebody actually threatened to break it down. But the moment there is a sense of community came in, they became stronger, right? So as an individual, you may not be strong, but as a collective, we are.
Sure. So we have next question from Nitin Patel. After watching your sensitive approach towards context and response, what do you feel about the importance of context for large public projects like Central Vista, which lack this participation and the intent for redoing it?
Yeah, so this is one of the critical project, right? I mean, it affects everybody. It's a nation space, and this is probably one project. If you had to really demonstrate public participation, this was the project. And this again goes back to what I talked about earlier: is that our agendas are set for 5 years, right? And we are so driven. Our aspiration, our young minds are so driven by seeing things tangible that we are actually not questioning the long-term sustainability of what we do. The after effects comes after we build things. It's like our flyovers, right? Every city we go, I mean, I often joke about it. All our politicians goes abroad to Barcelona, New York, etc., to see these things, and then they come back and build flyovers, right? And they don't realize none of those cities have flyovers. So one wonders what you're seeing, right? So we think there is a traffic problem in the junction. Like I'll give you a great example. A city like Chennai has 6% of its population, 6 to 8% of its population using cars. Right, 65% of the population use buses. Right, but we still build roads. We don't build sidewalks. Right, and we still build for the cars. And that's our problem. So Central Vista it was a great opportunity to kind of initiate public participation, engage with the public, because it is the nation space. It is a place for protest. It's extremely important that our cities or our seats of governments have public spaces next to it, because in a healthy democracy, we should be able to express our displeasure. We should be able to celebrate our wonderful moments all next to the seat of the government. And now, if now when you start to build these government offices right next to it, tomorrow it may be called public in the this thing on land use, but tomorrow there will be an issue of security. It is going to become eventually a gated community, right? It can't be taken away. The entire Nirbhaya law or the agitation to that happened, and it was successful because it was on that particular space. So it's very important that public is made part of this process. And this is not about politics. This is not about who initiate this project. Eventually it is our country, it's our space, it's a nation space. And we should be able to kind of be part of that process of making or shaping of that particular space. It can't be left to any set of politicians wishful thinking, because it is people's space. People has to be engaged with it.
Yes, like you always have been mentioning in your presentation, the collective realm has to be thought of when it comes to such public spaces. We have the next question is from Mr. Dharmesh Jadeja. So he says that always been a fan of your work and beautiful presentation, sketches and all. How would you define the relationship of your practice with the builders? Do you think there are lessons you can share on what is the trick to convince them with such brilliant solutions?
Yeah, this is the key is that give them the numbers. then they don't disturb you. Right? I mean, I think, see, I think
Yeah.
we always believe that nobody wants to do a bad job. Nobody is proud of a bad building. No matter how terrible a client is, they all take ownership of the buildings that they do, right? So I think we have to get it out of our mind that people wants to do bad buildings. Nobody wants to do bad buildings. Of course, there are challenges when you deal with builders and building community as such. I mean, in the sense that even today institutions are driven by private money. So anybody who deals with borrowed money, you have to work with in a particular way. So it is challenging. I mean, we are in some sense we don't work with too many builders. All these projects that we do are actually limited to 2 or 3 developers whom we started engaging with about 5 6 years ago, and they, I mean, they came from an aspirational direction. They wanted to do good buildings, and in fact, and all of them are. I mean, in the client that we have in Kerala is extremely aspirational. He doesn't pick on every little sort of dollar, but the client on Bangalore is extremely careful with economics, right? And
Yeah.
it's wonderful. I mean, I think the kind of learning that one gets from engaging with both of these clients is completely different and extremely kind of learning, because what happens is that, see, when somebody comes to you for affordable housing, you can't put expensive lures on it. It is no more affordable,
Yeah.
right? And I think we need to be conscious of the fact that what you build is eventually going, whatever they spend is eventually has to be sold or to someone else. So there has to be an affordability that gets carried over to the guy who buys it. So if I'm able to make a beautiful building in an affordable manner, then the benefit goes to the person who occupies that eventually, right? So I think we need to kind of understand the economics, and I think as architects we are never taught to kind of look at these critical aspects which today drives the thinking process or design process, which is the economics, how economics works, how one kind of deals with all these kind of critical aspects. And 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 to me personally, if you ask me, when you go out there, you explain the kind of presentation that I do, we do the same presentation to our clients. So you get them excited, you give them the numbers that they need to be able to make the project viable. You need to be conscious of the fact that which affordable segment they are going to sell it. And hence you need to make sure that what you're designing fits into that affordable segment. If I make that building expensive, which then can't be sold, why should I make a building which is not going to be occupied? It's as simple as that. It doesn't matter how beautiful that building is, that if that building has no takers, then that building failed, uh, right? I mean, it failed at many levels.
Yeah.
So we need to be conscious of all these things and try, and that's why I said the power of the limits. That's why I kind of quoted that word. It's the power of the limits, and the limits has great, you know, it's wonderful to engage with that limits because it opens out great creative solutions, and we should be able to engage with that. So those I can't. I will call him and give him all the other tougher private issues with developers.
Sure. Uh, we have one more anonymous question. So the question is, in the housing project of Bangalore, how did you deal with the challenges of the tree roots disturbing the building structure?
Yeah, so so we had to map all that. So even the basement extents have to be done in a way that it is clearly way away from all the roads. So we we had to work with specialists to kind of try and identify that. So all the basements are kind of setback. No structure comes close to that. There's enough setback left from all of them. There is quite a bit of cantilever as you go up from that to be able to kind of push back, but the structure itself is kind of set back, and all those calculations had to be done right at the beginning to be able to map it and kind of get it done. So yeah, that's, yeah, hopefully nothing happens. So
Sure. Uh, so we'll take a few questions if you don't mind, just one or two questions we have more to ask. Another question from an anonymous attendee. So what are the challenges you faced in managing structural system of campus building or buildings?
so structural systems.
Yeah, while designing or constructing the campus buildings.
Yeah, so we engage with the structural engineer right at the beginning. I think as soon as we have conceptual thoughts, of course, we all come with certain understanding of structures and structural systems, and we know what are the limits within which we are kind of starting to design. But what we do is that we try and engage with them at a very early stage, right after the initial thoughts come into our on our drawing boards, and within initial few weeks we start to engage with them, and then it becomes a process. I mean, you have to kind of constantly push them, they push us, and all these things are a negotiation. So what, I mean, with anything else also, I mean, it's what you see in what I presented is actually a constant negotiation with many stakeholders, whether it's other consultants, whether it's the client, whether it's whoever, it's this constant negotiation with all of them, and that is why it's important to understand what are the critical components of your design, right? I mean, I think what is it that I can negotiate? I think one of the things that we do right at the beginning is to kind of create that vision, so we are very clear in our mind what the meaning of this project is, right? And hence we also know what is it that we can negotiate and what is it that we can't negotiate, right? So these, and when you do large projects, that becomes extremely important. There is this wonderful quote by Bruce Mao, which I often use, when he says that about massive change. He's written that book called Massive Change, and he says massive change is not about the world of design, it's about the design of the world, right? So we are not obsessed about the world of the design, but we are obsessed about the design of the world, right? So what we do is to try and shape that world. Now, if in that process, if as a designer I need to negotiate to make a better world, I would negotiate, right? So I am willing to make that negotiation, because my job is, my eventual goal is to make a better world, and not a better or a better design, or try and make a better design world. So when you start to kind of look at, and that those are two completely different approaches. When you are obsessed with the world of design, it's very tough for you to kind of negotiate. And I'm not saying when you're obsessed with the world design of the world, you're not caring for the design. Of course, we are fascinated about design. We work very hard to do what we do, but we also know there are certain things. It's like what I told about Korea. The world grows in a completely different manner, different from what we think the world should grow. So hence, I should be able to constantly negotiate with that world, to be able to kind of constantly throw solutions. So if we don't find solutions to the challenges that we face today as a community, as an architecture community, we become meaningless. Right? I mean, we as a community become meaningful only if we constantly find solutions to the problems that exist within our context. And that is our primary job, is to find these solutions.
Yeah. With this idea, or the
Sorry, my battery was dying.
Yeah, no problem. So with this idea of we need to think about these changing dynamics that we are facing, what would you like to also being an academician to and you also mentioned about academics during your presentation. So what would you like to suggest or guide towards the newer generation or new aspirants who are coming out towards the field of architecture? So probably looking at how we can have a balance between Indian vernacular tectonics and innovative spatial solutions probably that are coming up.
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, I think you need to work hard. You come out of the willingness to work hard. I think this is one of the critical aspects of being an architect, right? I mean, you can be extremely talented, but you are starting to engage with a context which is even more challenging than you think are. Now, you need to be obsessed. You need to have the fascination to search, to find solution to the challenges that faces us. You need to be concerned about the things that bothers you around you. right? You need to be constantly observing things around you to be able to look at what are the things that you find are challenging, and constantly, if you have to constantly find solutions to that, you have to really work hard. There is nothing like a 9 to 5 an architect. Your mind has to be constantly working. You have to be a constant observer of things around you, right? And that doesn't mean that you screw up your life, huh? I mean, I'm not, that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying is that you need to be sensitive, and you need to have an eye to observe at any time that you walk in, right? And you
Yeah.
need to be bothered by the things around you. You need to develop positions to be able to be an architect who start to produce meaningful work or challenging works. Otherwise you solve brief, right? Every client comes with a brief, and you
Yeah.
solve that brief and you give it to them, right? And so you can, I mean, so if you want to be someone who kind of effect a change, and that's what Korea said at the end, no? And that last quote that I used about Korea, we are only as big as the questions we address. And this, to his mind, is a central riveting fact of life for architects in this third world. Not the size or the value of the projects we are working on, but the nature of the questions they raise, and which we must confront, a chance to grow the abiding virtue of a place in the sun. And I don't think there is any better way than putting it. You know?
Yeah.
So,
Definitely. We have few more, but I think there are many questions. So what we can do is probably we can, those who have more further questions, they can share it on our website or things like that, which we can probably, if you don't mind, we'll forward it to you and we'll answer them later on. So with this, I would like to request our principal, Dr. Supriyanini ma'am, to give the vote of thanks. And before actually, sorry, ma'am, just one thing I want to say to Biju sir is that it is
Yeah, yeah.
really an honor to look at this presentation. I'm really because I have been following you for a long time and your work inspires definitely. Yeah.
thank you.
So, ma'am.
Yeah. That was really very, very inspirational indeed for all our students and as well as all the participants, which was probably about 300 today. So, which was a great thing. And we really appreciate you joining us from all the way from Bangalore.
No, no,
So,
from Chennai.
oh, sorry, all the way from Chennai. Sorry, sorry. Although the distances don't matter really
Yeah.
nowadays. Yeah. We look forward to many more interactions today in future, and I would really thank you for you know inspiring us, all of us today. Architect Girish Doshi sir, thank you so much for making this possible, and we really appreciate your cooperation and the force behind the MMCOA teaching faculty team. Um, Thank you, all the participants who are joining us today. And let's continue this tomorrow as well. Same time, 4 o'clock for the next session with another great architect. So,
Thank you.
thank you again, Biju sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Girish. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Girish
Thank you.
sir. Yeah.
Will this be on, Tanay? Can I just go through these questions? Or
Yeah,
yes?
we can even share you these questions.
That'll
We'll
be
get a
wonderful.
report and share it with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll do that definitely. Thank you.